The Gobi wind had stopped. The heat pressed down on the excavation site, turning the sand into a fine, suffocating powder. Dr. Eris knelt by the trench, his trowel scraping against something that did not sound like stone. He slowed his movements, switching to a soft bristled brush. Grain by grain, the surface cleared. A rib cage emerged, bleached white, stark against the rusted earth. Eris paused. He wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at the surrounding soil. He cleared a wider perimeter. Another rib appeared, then a spine, then the curve of a pelvis. He stood up and signaled the team to stop. The silence of the desert floor was absolute, heavy enough to ring in his ears. He walked the perimeter of the trench, his boots crunching on the hard-packed surface. He looked down at the burial. It was not a random scatter of remains. The bones were laid out in a perfect, geometric circle. Every piece was aligned with mathematical precision. Eris felt the back of his neck prickle. They were not looking at a grave. They were looking at a warning. Something had placed these remains here with intent, and for the first time, the vast, empty desert felt crowded. Aris pulled his leather-bound notebook from his pack. The paper felt brittle under his shaking fingers. He knelt again, this time with a graphite pencil, measuring the distance between the ribcage and the next set of remains. He sketched the layout with quick, jagged strokes. Every skull faced the center. Every limb was tucked inward, pulled tight against the spine as if the creatures had been trying to shrink away from something outside the circle. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over a small, calcified joint. He nudged it. It did not shift. It was locked into the hard-packed earth. He moved to the next, then the next. The pattern was absolute. There was no chaos here, only a cold, rigid order. Sarah stood behind him, her shadow falling across the trench. She did not speak. The air felt heavy, stagnant. Aris finished the sketch, the lines on the page mirroring the nightmare in the dirt. He marked the center point with a heavy, dark cross. His pencil snapped. Eris stood up, his joints aching from the hours spent hunched over the dust. He gestured to the team. They moved in, shovels biting into the perimeter. For 3 days, they worked in rhythmic, exhausting shifts. The sand gave way to harder, compacted earth. As the trench widened, the true scale of the site revealed itself. A second ring appeared, concentric to the first, composed of smaller, fragmented remains. Then, a third ring emerged. Sarah knelt at the edge of the third ring, clearing away a layer of silt with a fine brush. She pointed. Beneath the dust, the ground was not natural. It was carved. A narrow, shallow channel ran through the hard-packed earth. Aris moved to her side, brushing away more debris. He found another, then a third, all converging at the center. The sun beat down, but the air within the trench felt cold. Eris realized they were not just excavating a grave. They were uncovering a map. Aris stepped away from the central cluster, his boots crunching on the dry, brittle earth of the perimeter. He knelt near a protruding edge of gray rock that had remained partially buried. With a small trowel, he scraped away the thick, hardened silt. The stone was not natural. It was a flat, heavy slab, polished smooth on one side. He wiped the dust from the surface and froze. Deep, rhythmic grooves scarred the stone. They were not accidental scratches or erosion. They were deliberate, parallel gouges, spaced with mathematical precision. Aris ran his fingers along the indentations. The depth of the marks suggested a force capable of tearing through solid rock with ease. He shifted his weight, looking for the start of the pattern, and found a second set of marks deeper into the slab. They were angled, jagged, and entirely intentional. He called Sarah over, pointing to the slab without speaking. She knelt beside him, her brush hovering over the stone. The rhythmic nature of the marks was undeniable. Aris stood up, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. The slab was not an isolated find. The air grew still, and the weight of the discovery settled in his chest. Aris signaled to Sarah. They left the perimeter and moved toward the heart of the site, stepping carefully between the concentric rings of bone. Every step felt like a violation of a long-held silence. The deeper they moved, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing against their skin with a heavy, static charge. They reached the center point where the carved pathways converged. Eris stopped. He looked around. Hundreds of skulls were arranged in a perfect, geometric circle, all facing inward, all staring directly at the spot where he stood. The hollow socket seemed to track his movement. Sarah joined him, her boots barely disturbing the fine gray dust. She did not speak. The silence of the desert floor was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the sound of their breathing. Eris looked at the remains. Every limb was tucked inward, every jawbone set in a rigid, calculated alignment. It was not a burial, it was a formation. The pressure in the air grew sharp, a physical weight that made his ears pop. He looked at Sarah. She was staring at the ground, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held her brush. They were standing in the eye of a storm made of bleached bone. Sarah knelt, her brush moving in slow, rhythmic arcs across the center of the circle. The dust rose in thin gray clouds, caught in the stagnant air. Aris watched her hand, his own breath held tight in his chest. He expected bone, perhaps a ritual blade, or the calcified remains of a central figure. Sarah stopped. She switched to a smaller, softer brush, clearing the fine silt from a flat, horizontal surface. A dull gray glint appeared beneath the grime. She worked faster now, her movements precise and focused. The stone emerged, inch by inch, polished to a mirror-like finish. It was a pedestal, perfectly circular, set flush into the hard-packed earth. Eris leaned in, his shadow falling across the stone. He waited for the sight of an artifact, a carving, or even a stain of age. There was nothing. The surface was smooth, unblemished, and entirely empty. No inscriptions marred the polished face. No offerings sat upon the stone. No remains of a central figure occupied the space. It was a void, a deliberate, hollow center designed to hold nothing at all. Sarah stood up, her hand still hovering over the cold stone. She looked at Eris, her eyes wide, searching for an explanation that did not exist. The silence of the desert seemed to amplify. Weeks of work followed. The team deployed ground-penetrating radar, the pulses vibrating through the hard-packed earth. Ari stood by the monitor, watching the screen for anomalies, for hidden chambers, or for the density of buried artifacts. The signal returned a flat, uniform line. Solid rock, nothing more. They moved the sensors, recalibrated, and scanned again. The result remained identical. Sarah collected soil samples from the perimeter, the center, and the pathways. She ran chemical tests, looking for blood, for organic decay, for any trace of human or animal presence. The vials remained clear. The data showed only sterile, ancient dust. There were no artifacts, no hidden caches, no remnants of a central figure. Eris walked the perimeter, his boots crunching on the stone slabs. He looked at the claw marks, deep and rhythmic. The team packed their gear in silence. As they loaded the final crate, Eris looked back at the site. The patterns remained. Back at the university, the images of the site hit the lecture hall screen with a sharp clinical clarity. The circular formation, captured from high above, drew immediate gasps from the faculty. Eris stood at the podium, watching his colleagues lean forward, their faces illuminated by the projected geometry of the bones. Theories erupted instantly. Some argued for a forgotten cult, a ritualistic site lost to time. Others dismissed the site as a sophisticated trap, a complex mechanism designed for a predator that never arrived. He zoomed in on the skulls, all facing the center, all positioned with a rigid, desperate precision. He moved to the final slide, the empty pedestal. The room fell quiet. The unspoken theory began to take root. Eris traced the line of the bones on the screen, his finger trembling. The question was what they were containing. The lecture hall emptied, but Eris remained. He sat alone, the photographs spread across the table like a map of a nightmare. He picked up the high-resolution prints, one by one. He traced the lines of the skulls, the curvature of the ribs, The precise mathematical spacing of the animal remains. The pattern was not a shrine. It was a barricade. He looked at the claw marks on the stone slab again, the depth of the gouges suggesting a frantic, desperate struggle. His mind raced over the data.
Sir.
If the pedestal was meant for an object, it would have been placed at the center. But the bones were not facing the center to worship. They were facing the center to watch. He leaned over the images, his breath hitching. The entire site was a cage, built with the singular, terrifying purpose of containment. He stared at the empty space where the pedestal stood, the white of the bones stark against the dark grain of the paper. A single, cold thought solidified in his mind. The bones were not guarding a treasure. They were the lock. He looked at the empty center, the void that had yielded no chemical traces, no organic decay, no artifacts. The question burned in the silence of the room. Did the barrier hold, or did it fail? He looked at the photos, waiting for an answer that would never come. The desert had kept its secret, and now the secret was his.